The cell was not large enough to contain the echoes of a life. They bounced off the damp, gray stone, whispers of a boyhood in sun-drenched fields, the roar of a crowded bar, the soft, trusting weight of a head on his lap. Captain Elias Vance sat on the edge of his cot, his back straight, a habit drilled into him by a decade of military service. It was a habit that felt absurd now, like polishing boots for a walk to the gallows. The verdict had been delivered 3 days ago. The word treason had been spoken in a clean, judicial tone, so divorced from the mud and blood and impossible choices of the front lines. He had not betrayed his country. He had tried to save his men. The distinction, it turned out, was a luxury the High Command could not afford in a time of total war. A scapegoat was needed, and Captain Elias Vance, the hero of the Carrion Ridge, was a perfect fit. His lawyer, a young man with a perpetually worried expression, had visited an hour ago. "I'm sorry, Elias. The appeal was denied. The execution is scheduled for 0600 tomorrow. 1 dawn. A military time for a military killing." Elias had simply nodded. He had exhausted his fear days ago, leaving behind a strange, hollow calm. "There's one thing," the lawyer had stammered, fumbling with his briefcase. "A final wish. The protocol allows for it. Within reason, of course." Elias hadn't even considered it. What was there to wish for? A last meal? Food had lost its taste. To see his family? His parents were gone, and the thought of his sister's tear-streaked face was a pain he couldn't bear. It would be a cruelty to her, a final memory of her brother caged like an animal. And then, unbidden, a memory surfaced. Not of a person, but of a presence, a warmth, a pair of soulful brown eyes that held no judgment, only unwavering devotion. "Argos," he whispered, the name a prayer on his lips. The lawyer leaned in. "I'm sorry." Elias looked up, and for the first time since his arrest, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed his face. "My dog. His name is Argos. He's at the kennel outside Fort Halcyon. I want to see my dog." The lawyer blinked. "Your dog." "That's my last wish." The process was a bureaucratic odyssey. A soldier's last wish was typically for a priest, a cigarette, or a letter to be delivered. A dog was unprecedented. Requests went up the chain of command, met with incredulity and scoffing. A dog? For a traitor? But the protocol was clear, and perhaps somewhere in that chain was a general who remembered his own childhood companion, or a clerk who saw the simple, profound humanity in the request. Late in the evening, the permission was granted. The night was the longest of Elias's life. He didn't sleep. He paced the 10 steps his cell allowed, his mind traveling back through the years. He'd found Argos, or rather, Argos had found him as a shivering, half-starved puppy in the rubble of a bombed-out village. The war was young then, and Elias's heart was not yet calloused. The little mongrel, a scruffy mix of shepherd and everything else, had limped towards him, tail tucked between his legs but eyes full of a desperate hope. Elias had shared his rations, and in return, the puppy had given him his absolute trust. Argos had become the regiment's mascot. He was more than a pet. He was a talisman. He could sense incoming shelling before the soldiers could, his low whine giving them precious seconds to find cover. He would sleep curled at the feet of the most homesick privates, a silent, furry comfort. But he was Elias's dog, through and through. Where Elias went, Argos followed. Through the sucking mud of the trenches, the frozen hell of the mountain passes, the eerie silence of abandoned towns. He remembered one night, during the relentless artillery barrage at Carrion Ridge. They were dug in, the world shaking itself to pieces around them. A young soldier, a boy no older than 18, was sobbing, his nerve gone. Elias, his own hands trembling, had watched as Argos left his side, padded over to the boy, and laid his head in his lap. The boy's sobs had subsided into hiccuping breaths, his fingers finding solace in the coarse fur of the dog's neck. That was the night before the order came, the order that would end his career and his life. They were told to hold the ridge at all costs. But all costs meant the certain annihilation of his entire company. Intelligence was wrong. The enemy force was 3 times the size they'd been told. Seeing no other way, Elias had made the call to retreat, to live to fight another day. He had saved 80 men, but he had disobeyed a direct order. In the eyes of the court-martial, the 80 lives were irrelevant. The principle was everything. The memory of that retreat was a blur of smoke and noise. But one image was crystal clear. Argos, running beside him, glancing up every few seconds as if to make sure Elias was still there. A key turned in the heavy lock of his cell, jolting him back to the present. It was 0500. The dawn was still a secret held by the night. The warden, a stern man named Croft, stood there with 2 guards. "It's time, Vance." Elias stood, his legs feeling like wood. "My wish." Warden Croft's face was unreadable. "It has been arranged. Come with me." They didn't lead him to the execution yard. Instead, they took him to a small, barren courtyard, an unused space between 2 wings of the prison. The air was cold and carried the scent of damp earth and decay. The sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep, bruised gray. And then he saw him. A sergeant from the Kennel Corps stood holding a leash. And at the end of that leash was Argos. The dog was older, his muzzle now frosted with gray. He looked confused, his ears slightly back, his body tense as he took in the unfamiliar, grim surroundings. He was still well cared for, his coat clean, but there was a sadness in his posture, the slump of an animal that had been waiting for a long, long time. The sergeant unclipped the leash. For a moment, Argos just stood there, sniffing the air. Then his head turned, his eyes locked onto Elias. It was as if a current of pure electricity passed between them. The confusion in Argos's eyes vanished, replaced by a dawning, incredulous recognition. A low, wondering whine escaped his throat. "Argos!" Elias breathed, his own rigid military composure shattering. He fell to his knees. With a burst of joy that defied the grimness of the place, Argos bounded forward. He didn't just run. He flew across the cobblestones. He launched himself at Elias, a wriggling, whining, ecstatic whirlwind of fur and love. His tail was a frantic metronome, beating against Elias's legs. He covered Elias's face in frantic, slobbering licks, nuzzling his neck, pressing his head into Elias's chest as if trying to merge with him. Elias wrapped his arms around the dog, burying his face in the familiar, musky scent of his fur. He was laughing and crying at the same time, great, heaving sobs that he had kept locked inside for months. All the fear, the anger, the bitter injustice, it all melted away in the furnace of this unconditional love. "I'm here, boy. I'm here," he choked out, his voice thick with tears. "I missed you. Oh, God, I missed you so much." Argos responded with a series of happy yelps, as if scolding him for being gone so long, then immediately forgiving him. He leaned his full weight against Elias, his entire body quivering with delight. The guards and the warden looked on. One of the guards, a hard-faced man who had seen his share of misery, discreetly turned away, clearing his throat and pretending to study the wall. Warden Croft's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. He had overseen dozens of last meetings, weeping wives, stoic fathers, hysterical mothers. He had seen men beg for their lives, and he had seen men meet their end with cold defiance. But he had never seen this. This raw, wordless reunion between a man and his dog. It was, in its own way, more sacred than any last rites. For 10 precious minutes, Elias was not a disgraced captain, not a condemned traitor. He was just a man, reunited with his best friend. He scratched behind Argos's ears, the spot he had always loved, and the dog groaned with pleasure, leaning into the touch. He ran his hands over the old scar on Argos's flank, a souvenir from a piece of shrapnel years ago. He looked into those deep brown eyes and saw no trace of the court-martial, the prison, the impending doom. He saw only the same absolute, unwavering faith that had greeted him every morning in the trenches. This was why he had asked for him. Not for comfort, though he was comforted. Not for distraction, though he was distracted. He had asked for Argos because in the eyes of his dog, he was still the man he used to be. He was still Captain Elias Vance, the one who shared his rations, who threw sticks in rare moments of peace, who provided a safe place to sleep. In Argos's love, he was absolved of all his supposed sins. The sky was turning a pale, watery blue. Warden Croft took a hesitant step forward. "Captain Vance," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "It's time." Elias's heart clenched. He held Argos tighter, feeling the dog's steady, trusting heartbeat against his own racing one. He took a deep, shuddering breath, inhaling the scent of his friend for the last time. "Okay, boy," he whispered into Argos's ear, his voice steady now, filled with profound and peaceful finality. "It's okay. You're a good dog. The best dog." He stood up, his legs weak. Argos looked up at him, tail still wagging, but a hint of confusion returning to his eyes. He sensed a shift. The sergeant came forward and reluctantly clipped the leash back on. As he began to lead Argos away, the dog resisted. He planted his feet, looking back over his shoulder at Elias, letting out a confused, pleading whine. "Go on, Argos," Elias said, his voice firm but gentle. "Go on." The sergeant tugged gently on the leash, and Argos took a few reluctant steps, his eyes never leaving Elias. At the doorway leading out of the courtyard, he stopped one last time. He turned his head, and his gaze met Elias's. It was a long, deep look, full of a love that needed no words. Elias gave him a small, sad smile and a nod. It was a goodbye. Then Argos was gone. The courtyard was empty again, save for Elias and his escorts. The world felt colder, the silence heavier. But Elias felt a strange peace. The hollowness was gone, filled with a memory of that frantic, loving welcome. The guards approached him. He didn't need their prompting. He straightened his back, the soldier's habit returning one last time. He looked towards the eastern sky, where the sun was just beginning to crown the horizon with a thin line of gold. He walked with them, not to his death, but with a memory of a loyal friend's face etched into his soul. The last thing Captain Elias Vance felt was not the cold metal of a rifle barrel, but the phantom warmth of a dog's head resting in his lap, and the unshakable certainty that, in at least one heart in the world, he had been and would always be a good man.